My daughter told everyone he's just a stranger. My stepfather is my real family, and let him walk her down the aisle. When her mom passed away and he disappeared, she suddenly needed me for everything, but I refused to help. I'm 47, male, a divorced dad, and my 20-year-old daughter just reached out after basically pretending I was dead for over a decade. Context is important here, so bear with me. Back when Sophie was 8, her mom Meredith and I split. Standard stuff. Grew apart, fought constantly, decided to call it quits. What wasn't standard was what came next. The moment we filed, Meredith went full nuclear option. I'm talking scorched earth, take no prisoners level of crazy that would make even the most bitter divorce attorneys uncomfortable. She immediately filed for full custody and supervised visitation only. Her reasoning: I had anger management issues and was emotionally unstable around children. News to me, considering I'd been coaching Sophie's softball team for 3 years and never so much as raised my voice at a practice. But apparently, according to Meredith's sworn testimony, I'd been secretly losing my temper and scaring our daughter for months. The family court system in this country is basically designed to believe whatever the mom says first. So guess who got believed? Not the guy who had to start paying for anger management classes. He didn't need just to prove he wasn't the monster his ex-wife was painting him as. I spent $8,000 on a lawyer who basically told me to smile, nod, and hope the judge would eventually see through the BS. The whole thing was like being stuck in some twisted legal version of Groundhog Day. Every hearing was the same script. Meredith would bring up some new incident that supposedly happened months ago. I'd sit there looking confused because none of it was real, and my lawyer would scramble to prove a negative. Try explaining to a judge that you didn't lose your temper at a Chuck E. Cheese when your ex-wife has a detailed story about you yelling at staff and making Sophie cry. The fact that I hadn't set foot in a Chuck E. Cheese in 2 years didn't seem to matter. Meanwhile, Meredith was working on Sophie behind the scenes. I'd pick her up for my court-mandated 2-hour Saturday visits, and she'd be weird and distant. Not like a normal kid dealing with divorce, distant, like she'd been coached on what to say and what not to say. The worst part was watching it happen in real time. One week, Sophie would hug me goodbye and ask when she could come stay at my new apartment. The next week, she'd barely look at me and would flinch when I tried to buckle her seatbelt. Kids don't just develop trust issues overnight unless someone's been filling their head with garbage. I kept detailed notes of every interaction, every phone call, every missed opportunity to see her, because of some last-minute emergency Meredith would manufacture. My lawyer said documentation was key, but honestly, the judge barely glanced at any of it. The system had already decided I was the problem. 5 years. I spent 5 years getting jerked around by family court, paying legal fees I couldn't afford, and watching my relationship with my daughter get dismantled by someone who was supposed to want what was best for our kid. So by the time Sophie was around 11, Meredith had found her upgrade. Sam, this guy, was like someone ordered the perfect suburban dad from a catalog, owned his own HVAC company, drove a lifted truck with all the bells and whistles, and season tickets to the local college football team. He looked like he belonged in a beer commercial, but the family-friendly kind where everyone's grilling burgers and playing catch in the backyard. Don't get me wrong, I'm not hating the guy for being successful, but it was pretty obvious. Meredith had found someone who could provide the lifestyle she'd always wanted. And I wasn't exactly bringing home HVAC business owner money working as a welder. Sam could afford the big house in the good school district, family vacations to Disney World, and all the stuff that makes teenage girls think their stepdad is cooler than their real dad. The timing was perfect too. Sam showed up right when Sophie was hitting that age where kids start caring about image and status. Suddenly she's posting Instagram photos from their lake house wearing expensive volleyball gear, getting dropped off at school in his company truck with the custom paint job. Meanwhile, I'm still driving a 2003 Honda Civic and living in a 1-bedroom apartment because half my paycheck goes to child support and legal fees. Within 6 months of them getting serious, my already limited access to Sophie basically evaporated. Suddenly, every weekend I was supposed to have her, there was some conflict. Sam was taking her to see a baseball game. They had family plans. She was sick. There was always something. And my lawyer kept telling me to document it and be patient, because rushing back to court would make me look like the obsessive ex-husband. I kept a dedicated folder on my computer, labeled cancelled visits, with screenshots of every text and email. My personal favorite was the time Meredith claimed Sophie couldn't come because she'd gotten food poisoning from a school lunch and needed to be monitored for potential complications. Turned out Sam had gotten last-minute tickets to a college football game that same weekend. The breaking point came during Christmas when Sophie was 12. I'd bought her this necklace. Nothing crazy expensive because I was already broke from legal fees, but it was nice. Silver chain with a small heart pendant. I thought maybe if I could just hand it to her personally, instead of going through Meredith's filter, we might actually have a real conversation. I drove to their house on Christmas Eve not to cause drama, just to drop off a gift for my daughter, like any normal parent would do. I rang the doorbell. Meredith answered, and before I could even say Merry Christmas, she was telling me I needed to leave immediately because I was violating the custody agreement. I tried explaining that I just wanted to give Sophie her present, maybe talk to her for 5 minutes. Meredith started recording me on her phone saying I was being aggressive and refusing to leave her property. The whole thing was insane. I wasn't yelling, wasn't being threatening. I was literally just standing on the porch holding a small jewelry box. 2 days later, cops showed up at my apartment with papers. Restraining order. Apparently my attempt to deliver a Christmas present was evidence of continued harassment and stalking behavior. The order specifically mentioned that I had aggressively confronted Meredith at her home and refused to respect boundaries when asked to leave. My lawyer said we could fight it, but fighting a restraining order basically requires proving a negative, and judges don't like to take chances when kids are involved. So that was it. Game over. No more supervised visits, no more phone calls, no more awkward small talk in family court hallways. I was officially persona non grata in my own daughter's life. Around this time, Sam and Meredith got married. Sophie took Sam's last name that same year. I found out when I saw some local charity fundraiser things shared on social media, where she was tagged as Sophie Sam's last name with a caption about supporting local families. There was Meredith beaming next to this girl who used to be my daughter, both of them wearing matching t-shirts for Sam's HVAC company's softball team. That's when I finally understood I wasn't just being pushed out, I was being completely replaced. And everyone involved was perfectly fine with pretending the first years of Sophie's life had never happened. So this is where things get weird. Fast forward about 8 years. I'm 47 now, living a pretty quiet life about 3 hours away from where all that drama went down. I've got a decent welding job, small apartment, no major complaints. I stopped checking social media years ago because seeing glimpses of the life my daughter was living without me was just depressing. During those 8 years, I basically rebuilt myself from scratch, worked overtime whenever I could get it, saved up enough to buy some decent tools, even started doing side jobs on weekends fixing lawnmowers and small engines. It kept me busy and helped me forget about the whole mess. I'd go to work, hit the gym afterward, grab dinner somewhere, watch Netflix and pass out. Rinse and repeat. The loneliness hit sometimes, especially around holidays, or when I'd see other guys at work talking about their kids' graduation parties or college visits, but I'd learned to shut that down quickly. You can't miss something you never really had. And by the time Sophie was a teenager, I was already more like a stranger than a father anyway. Then 2 weeks ago, I get a text from a number I don't recognize. Just says, "Can we talk?" I get random spam texts all the time, so I ignored it. Next day another text. It's Sophie. That stopped me cold. I hadn't heard from her directly in over 8 years. Last time we spoke she was 12, and telling me through tears that she didn't want to see me anymore because I scared her. Now she's 20 and suddenly wants to chat. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to just block the number and pretend I never saw it. But I'll admit there was this tiny part of my brain that wondered if maybe she'd figured out what really happened back then. Maybe she'd realized her mom had been feeding her lies. Maybe this was going to be one of those reconciliation stories you see in movies where the kid apologizes and wants to rebuild the relationship. I was sitting in my truck outside work staring at the messages when Troy knocked on my window. Troy's this 52-year-old welder who works the next bay over from me. Guy's been through 2 divorces himself and has exactly 0 patience for family drama. He took one look at my face and said, "Either you just found out you're dying, or your ex-wife's back to screwing with your head." I showed him the texts. Troy read them, handed my phone back and said, "Kid's broke. Guaranteed. Nobody calls their dead dad after 8 years unless they need something." Then he walked away like the conversation was over. Yeah, that's not what this was. The third message was longer and basically laid out the real reason for contact. Her mom Meredith had died from cancer after what sounded like a pretty brutal fight. I had no idea she was even sick. We don't exactly run in the same circles anymore. But here's the kicker. Sam, the perfect stepdad who'd replaced me, decided to end it and follow Meredith 1 week after she passed. The way Sophie wrote it was weirdly matter-of-fact. Mom's gone. Sam followed. Now I'm alone, and don't know who else to turn to. No emotion. No I'm sorry we lost touch. No acknowledgement that she'd spent the last 8 years treating me like I didn't exist. Just logistics. She needed help with funeral planning, estate stuff, probate court, next of kin laws. Basically all the paperwork nightmare that comes with people dying. And apparently I was the only person left in her life who might be able to help her figure it out. The whole thing felt surreal. This is the same girl who'd stood in front of 150 wedding guests and let another man walk her down the aisle while she called me a stranger. The same person who'd legally changed her name to erase me from her identity. And now that her fantasy family had imploded suddenly, I was worth talking to again. I sat on those messages for a week. Every night I'd read them again and try to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Sad that Meredith was dead. We'd been divorced for 8 years, and she'd made my life hell during most of that time. Sorry that Sam was gone. The guy had been perfectly happy to play replacement dad, while I got completely erased from the picture. Mostly what I felt was tired, and maybe a little bit like I was being used because this wasn't Dad. I miss you and want you back in my life. This was Dad. I need free legal advice, and you're the only sucker left who might help me. The thing is, I'd already grieved losing my daughter years ago. When she changed her name, when I saw those wedding photos, when I finally accepted that the system had let Meredith turn her into someone who genuinely believed I was dangerous. I'd already said goodbye to that relationship. And now she expected me to just jump back in and play cleanup crew for the mess left behind by the people who'd replaced me after 8 years of radio silence. So I decided not to respond to her messages. Figured that would be the end of it. She'd get the hint and find someone else to deal with her problems. Apparently my brother had other ideas. 3 days after I ignored the last message, my doorbell rings. I open it expecting Amazon delivery, or maybe Jehovah's Witnesses, but it's my brother Ryan holding a box of grocery store muffins and wearing that expression guys get when they're about to stage an intervention. We haven't been super close in recent years. He knew about the divorce and custody mess, but never really got involved, which I appreciated at the time. Now I'm wishing he'd kept that same energy. He walks in without being invited and starts right in with, "She's still your daughter, and you have no idea what she's been through." I let him talk, because I didn't feel like having this argument on my front porch where the neighbors could hear. Turns out, Sophie had somehow tracked down Ryan's number and called him crying about how alone she was and how I was the only family she had left. Ryan ate it up completely. He's got 2 kids of his own, and I think he was projecting some kind of what if my kids needed help and couldn't reach me scenario onto this situation. But here's where it gets interesting. As Ryan is going through his whole speech about forgiveness and second chances, I start asking questions like, why isn't Sophie turning to Sam's family for help? She's been part of that family for like 6 years, took their name called Sam Dad in public. Where are they in this crisis? Ryan gets uncomfortable and admits that apparently Sophie burned those bridges pretty spectacularly. Turns out while Meredith was dying, Sophie kept the whole cancer thing secret from extended family until basically the final 2 weeks. Nobody got to say goodbye. Nobody knew how bad it was. And everyone felt blindsided when she died. But wait, it gets worse. While Meredith was in hospice barely conscious, Sophie somehow managed to sell her grandmother's house behind everyone's back. This was Meredith's mom's place that had been in the family for 3 generations. Meredith's cousins thought they were inheriting it, but Sophie put it on the market and pocketed the money while her mom was literally dying. I don't know the legal details of how she pulled that off, but Meredith's side of the family lost their minds and cut Sophie off completely. Can't say I blame them. Then there's Sam's side. Apparently his 2 adult kids from his first marriage had been having problems with Sophie and Meredith for months before any of this went down. They claimed Sophie and Meredith had isolated Sam from his family, wouldn't let him see his grandkids, and were basically controlling his whole life. The more Ryan talked, the clearer it became that Sophie hadn't just burned bridges, she'd napalmed them. According to what Ryan had pieced together from her phone call, Sam's daughter had actually tried to do an intervention about 6 months before he died. She'd shown up at their house with her kids wanting to know why Sam never called anymore and why he'd missed 2 birthdays in a row. Sophie apparently answered the door and told her that Sam was too stressed to deal with family drama and that maybe they should give him space. The daughter never got to talk to Sam directly, and when she tried calling later, Sophie would always answer and say he was sleeping or busy or not feeling well. After Sam died, his oldest son started making noise about suing because he thinks Sophie manipulated his dad into changing beneficiaries on insurance policies while he was grieving and emotionally unstable. According to Ryan, the son claims Sam was actually trying to write Sophie out of his will completely, but died before he could finalize the paperwork. So now Sam's kids hate her. Meredith's family won't speak to her, and she's sitting on a bunch of money and property that half the people involved think she shouldn't have. And her solution is to reach out to the father she legally disowned and ask him to help her keep what she's got. I asked Ryan straight up, why exactly should I care about any of this? His answer was basically that Sophie was just a kid when all the custody stuff happened and didn't know what she was doing. But that excuse doesn't really work when you're talking about a 20-year-old adult who's been making calculated decisions about estates and property sales. She knew exactly what she was doing and is now dealing with the consequences. Ryan got frustrated when he realized I wasn't budging and started with the guilt trip about how Sophie was going to spiral, and I'd regret not helping if something happened to her. I reminded Ryan that this same person spent 8 years telling everyone I was essentially a deadbeat stranger who didn't matter. After Ryan left, I got a voicemail from Sophie. Totally different tone from the previous messages. She was pissed. Said something like, fine, stay out of it like you always have. Just know I'll tell everyone you let me drown. So now we're back to the same playbook from when she was a teenager. If Dad doesn't do what I want, Dad becomes the villain in the story. Some things never change. I blocked her number after that. If she wants something from me going forward, she can hire a lawyer like her mom used to do. Update. Hey Reddit, it's me again. Back with an update. Remember how I said I blocked my daughter's number and figured that was the end of it? Yeah, that was naive. Apparently when you burn bridges with everyone else in your life, you get creative about dragging people back into your mess. About a week after I told my brother to stay out of it and blocked Sophie's calls, I got a letter in the mail that looked like one of those fake legal notices scammers send out. You know the ones. Urgent. Respond immediately or face serious consequences in bold letters across the top. Except this one was real. Court summons. I was being subpoenaed as a witness in a civil case involving Sam's estate. Apparently his kids had followed through on their threat to sue Sophie over the inheritance stuff. I called my lawyer immediately because getting dragged into legal battles is exactly what I'd been trying to avoid for the past decade. We went through all the paperwork together, and that's when we found the real problem. Sophie had submitted a sworn statement to the court, claiming that I'd been back in her life for months before Sam died. According to her version of events, we'd reconnected, and I'd been providing emotional support and guidance as she dealt with losing 2 parental figures. She made it sound like I was some kind of wise father figure, helping her navigate difficult family dynamics with grace and maturity. None of that was true. I hadn't spoken to her in 8 years before she texted me after Meredith died, and even then I'd ignored her messages. But now her legal team had put my name in court documents and submitted this fictional version of our relationship as part of their defense strategy. The really messed up part was how detailed her lies were. She claimed we'd had weekly phone conversations where I'd helped her understand Sam's depression and given her advice about supporting him through his grief. She even said I'd suggested specific strategies for helping him cope with Meredith's illness. It was like she'd written fan fiction about having a relationship with me. My lawyer filed an immediate motion to correct the record. We submitted timestamps from her texts, screenshots of blocked calls, and a formal statement that I'd had zero involvement in anything related to Sam, his estate, or any financial decisions. But the damage was done. I was now officially part of this case, whether I wanted to be or not. The court scheduled a deposition and subpoenaed me to appear as a material witness. Thankfully it was virtual, but I still had to take time off work and sit through 2 hours of questions about my non-existent relationship with Sophie. Sam's kids were on the call, and their lawyer asked pretty direct questions. How long had I been back in Sophie's life? What kind of conversations had we had about Sam's mental state? Had Sophie ever expressed concerns about being overwhelmed or needing help with decisions? All my answers were the same. I wasn't involved. I hadn't offered help. I wasn't there. But that's when some interesting details came out about what had actually been happening in that house. According to Sam's son, Sophie, and Meredith had basically taken control of Sam's communication with the outside world during his final year. They were screening his phone calls, checking his email, and had convinced him that his own kids were trying to manipulate him financially. The son said Sam had become paranoid and withdrawn, talking about people trying to control him, and had actually contacted a lawyer about changing his will to remove Sophie as a beneficiary. That's when Meredith apparently threatened to leave him if he went through with it, and even said she'd exposed some personal details about his past if he tried to sabotage Sophie's future. The paperwork never got finalized before Sam died, which is why Sophie inherited everything based on the previous version of his will. But here's the thing that really got to me. Sophie had used my name in her court filings purely for optics. She knew Sam's kids would come after her, so she figured if she could make it look like she had family support, especially from a biological parent, it would make her seem more sympathetic and responsible. She didn't want me in her life. She wanted my name on a piece of paper to make her look better in front of a judge. When I told Troy about it later, he just shook his head and said, "She dragged your name into court because she knew nobody else would vouch for her. Pathetic. My lawyer says we're trying to get my name completely removed from any future proceedings, but it's already on the official record. I've had to waste money, take time off work, and deal with stress I didn't ask for just to clean up a lie someone else told about me. So I thought I was done with all this after the court stuff got sorted out. My name was cleared. I'd given my deposition, and I figured Sophie would move on to bothering someone else. Should have known better. I work as a welder for a mid-sized manufacturing company. I keep my head down, do my job, and don't talk about personal stuff because frankly, there hasn't been much worth discussing. People know I have a daughter I'm not close with, but nobody's ever pushed for details. About a week ago, I'm in a morning safety meeting going over production schedules when I get paged to come down to the front desk. That never happens, unless it's HR, or maybe a problem with my car in the parking lot. I walk out to the lobby and freeze. Sitting there with a baby in her arms is Sophie. Before I can even process what's happening, the receptionist smiles and says, "She said she was your daughter and wanted to surprise you. Like this is some heartwarming family reunion instead of someone who's been legally estranged from me for years." Sophie stands up holding this baby, acting like we're old friends catching up. She starts talking about how the baby is her daughter and how she's been figuring things out lately and thought maybe it was time her kid had a real grandparent in her life. I'm standing there in my work clothes in the middle of my office lobby with co-workers walking by, trying to process the fact that the person who called me a stranger and used my name as a legal prop is now trying to hand me a baby and play happy family. The whole scene was surreal. Sophie's talking a mile a minute about how the baby Emma apparently is 8 months old and super smart and would love to get to know her grandpa. She's bouncing this kid on her hip like we're at some family barbecue instead of my workplace where I'm clearly uncomfortable and everyone's staring. I could see guys from my shift peeking around corners, probably wondering if this was some Jerry Springer episode about to go down. Dave from maintenance actually stopped what he was doing and stood in the hallway watching like it was cable TV. The whole thing was embarrassing as hell. I told her this wasn't the place for any of this, and I needed to get back to work. She didn't seem bothered at all, just kept talking like this was normal, like there wasn't years of silence and legal battles between us. I told her flat out that I wasn't interested in playing family now, and that she shouldn't show up at my job again. Then I walked back upstairs without looking back. By lunch, half the shop knew. People kept coming by asking if that was my daughter, what the story was, whether I was a grandpa now. Mike from the cutting station walked over grinning and said, "So you going to babysit on weekends now?" Another guy asked if I was going to start bringing baby pics to show off. I looked up from my workbench and said, "That kid's not mine, and neither is her mess. Drop it." The smiles disappeared real quick, and everyone went back to their own business. Troy came by around 2 p.m. with his standard diplomatic approach. "So I hear your family situation just got more complicated," he said, leaning against my workbench. "Want me to explain to people that she's basically a stranger, or are we going with the whole mysterious family drama angle?" I told him the basics, that she'd shown up out of nowhere trying to force some kind of relationship. Troy nodded and said, "Yeah, that tracks. Nothing says I want you in my life like ambushing someone at work with a baby." He grabbed his gear and added, "Next time tell security to escort her out. This isn't Jerry Springer." Then around 300 p.m., the receptionist hands me something Sophie had left behind. It was a small photo album with pictures of me and her from when she was little, me pushing her on swings her at a school recital, Christmas mornings, that kind of thing. There was a note at the front that just said, "In case you forgot." I didn't take it home, left it locked in my desk drawer. Next morning I had to meet with HR. They were polite but clear. The situation had caused disruption in the workplace. There had been complaints about unprofessional behavior in the lobby, and multiple employees had been distracted asking questions about family drama. I explained the situation. They asked if I felt safe, which honestly made me realize how this whole thing must have looked to people who don't know the backstory. So they flagged her name with security and told the front desk not to let her in the building anymore. But the damage was done. There are whispers now. My supervisor hasn't said anything directly, but I can tell the dynamic is different. People think I'm hiding some messy family situation, and they're not wrong. They just don't understand what kind of mess it actually is. This isn't some simple father-daughter riff that needs healing. This is someone who spent years convincing everyone I was dangerous, then pretended I didn't exist, then tried to use my name for legal cover, and now wants to waltz back into my life. The baby thing was calculated. She figured showing up with a grandchild might force me to soften up, because what kind of monster turns away his own grandchild, right? But that baby isn't my grandchild. I'm not her grandfather. I'm just some guy who used to be married to her grandmother, before her mother systematically erased me from their family. I haven't touched that photo album. I'm not interested in nostalgia trips. That version of Sophie in those pictures is gone, replaced by someone who made very deliberate choices about who she wanted in her life. And it wasn't me. She wants to pretend we have some kind of relationship, but we don't. And showing up at my job with a baby isn't going to change that. I've updated my security information at work and made it clear that any future contact should go through a lawyer. I'm done being someone's backup plan. Update. Hey guys, it's been a while, over a year since Sophie showed up at my job with her baby, trying to force some kind of family reunion. Everything went quiet for months. Thought I was done. But then 2 weeks ago, something showed up in my mailbox. Thick envelope from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside were scanned documents, written statements, and a USB drive. Attached was a cover letter from a private investigator working for Sam's son, the one who's been fighting over the estate this whole time. Turns out they'd been going through a storage unit that Meredith had rented under her name in another city. Found old computers, financial paperwork, random photos, and a box of journals. And in that box were handwritten pages and cassette tapes of Meredith, basically recording herself venting about everything. The divorce, the custody battle, her marriage to Sam, all of it. I didn't listen to the audio files, but the written statements were enough. Meredith had documented exactly how she'd coached Sophie to say specific things about me during the custody hearings. She wrote about lying to the court about incidents that never happened, just so she could get full control and move on with Sam without any interference from me. In one entry, she flat out admitted that she was making up stories about my temper and emotional instability because she knew family court judges would side with her if they thought I was potentially dangerous. She wrote about how she'd prepped Sophie before supervised visits, telling her to watch for signs of my anger, so she'd have something to report back. The investigator had highlighted some particularly brutal sections. Meredith wrote about how she'd tell Sophie that I was getting angry, even when I was just talking normally, and how she'd ask leading questions afterward like, "Did Daddy seem scary today? Or did you feel safe with him?" She documented which responses worked best in court and which stories the judge seemed to believe most readily. There was even a section where Meredith complained about how hard it was to keep Sophie confused about what was real. She wrote about how Sophie would sometimes come home from visits happy and wanting to call me, and Meredith would have to remind her about the bad things I'd supposedly done to keep her properly afraid. But it gets worse. She also wrote about Sam and how he wasn't initially on board with completely cutting me out of Sophie's life. Apparently, he thought it was too extreme and that kids needed their biological fathers. So Meredith started working on him slowly, turning him against his own family and isolating him from his kids so that Sophie could eventually inherit everything he had. This lined up with what Sam's son had claimed during the lawsuit, that Sam had been planning to change his will but never got the chance because Meredith used guilt, financial pressure, and threats to keep him in line. The investigator wanted to know if I'd testify in the appeal process for Sam's estate. I told him no. I'd already said everything I needed to say in my previous deposition. He asked if he could use that testimony again, and I said yes, but I wasn't getting more involved than that. 5 days ago, I got an email from Sophie, first direct contact in over a year. She said she'd been shown copies of her mother's journals and recordings. Said she didn't know what was real and what wasn't, whether her memories had been manipulated or who anyone really was anymore. She asked if I'd meet with her to help her understand the truth, not to fix our relationship, not to rebuild anything, just to give her answers. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading this email when Troy knocked on my door. I'd called him over because honestly I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for wanting to ignore this. Troy read the email, handed my phone back and said, Let me get this straight. She spent 8 years treating you like a dangerous stranger, showed up at your job with a baby trying to guilt trip you, lied about you in court, and now that mommy's diary proves what you knew all along. She wants you to play therapist. I nodded. Troy shook his head and said, "Yeah, that's going to be a no from me, Chief. You know what she's really asking for? She wants you to forgive her without her having to actually apologize. She wants you to explain away 8 years of her choices because now she's uncomfortable with who she is." He grabbed a drink from my fridge and added, "Some people don't get closure. Welcome to the club." I didn't respond to her email. I'm not going to. Here's what I know. I spent years trying to be part of her life. I took every legal route available. I tried being patient. I tried writing letters. I even tried showing up to events I wasn't invited to just to show support from the back of the room. Every single attempt got blocked, twisted, or used against me. She called me a stranger in court. She told people I was emotionally unstable. When she got married, she let another man walk her down the aisle and posted a caption calling him the only father I've ever had. I wasn't even mentioned. When she needed help after her fantasy family collapsed, I suddenly became useful again. But even then it wasn't real. When that didn't work, she tried the baby angle, showing up at my workplace like some kind of ambush reunion. Now that the truth about Meredith has come out, she wants me to fill in the gaps. But that's not my job anymore. I didn't raise the version of Sophie that exists now. I wasn't allowed to. Meredith built that version, shaped her worldview, gave her the fake stories and the twisted loyalties. When the foundation finally cracked, I wasn't going to be the one crawling through the rubble trying to rebuild something I never had a hand in constructing. Sophie says she doesn't know what's real. Maybe that's true, but I know I was kept out. I know I was erased. I know I was only pulled back in when everything collapsed. And I know I was never seen as a father until it was useful to have one again. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. If she wants to know who her mother really was, she's got the journals. If she wants to know what happened with Sam's family, they've been talking. If she wants to know who I am, there are photo albums from when she was little that can remind her. And if that's not enough, she'll have to make peace with what she doesn't know. I didn't respond to her email. I won't. Some bridges once burned stay burned, and that's okay with me. She made her choices. She can live with them.